On a quiet Sunday evening in August 1971, millions of Americans settled in front of their television sets expecting their regular programming. Instead, they got something extraordinary. President Richard Nixon appeared on screen to announce an economic policy shift so dramatic, so unprecedented, that most viewers couldn't fully grasp what they were witnessing. In calm, measured tones, Nixon explained that the United States would no longer exchange dollars for gold. The gold window, as it was known, was closing. What he didn't say, what he couldn't say, was that this single decision would fundamentally reshape the global economy for the next 50-plus years and counting. This wasn't just a policy adjustment or a temporary measure, though Nixon framed it that way. This was the moment when money itself changed, when the ancient link between currency and precious metal was severed forever, and when America essentially rewrote the rules of international finance in the middle of the game. To understand why this happened, you have to go back to the ashes of World War II, when the global economy lay in ruins, and the victorious Allied powers faced the monumental task of rebuilding not just cities and factories, but the entire framework of international commerce. In July 1944, representatives from 44 nations gathered at a resort in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to hammer out a new monetary order. The United States emerged from the war holding roughly two-thirds of the world's monetary gold, and possessed the only major industrial economy that hadn't been bombed into rubble. This put America in an unassailable position to dictate terms, and the system they created reflected that dominance. Under what became known as the Bretton Woods system, other countries would peg their currencies to the U.S. dollar at fixed exchange rates, and the dollar itself would be convertible to gold at $35 per ounce. It was elegant, it was simple, and for about 25 years, it worked brilliantly. The early Bretton Woods era was a golden age in more ways than one. Europe rebuilt through the Marshall Plan, Japan transformed from a devastated archipelago into an economic powerhouse, and international trade flourished under the stability of fixed exchange rates. American businesses expanded globally, confident that currency fluctuations wouldn't suddenly wipe out their profits. Foreign central banks happily accumulated dollar reserves because those dollars were, quite literally, as good as gold. Any country that doubted the value of its dollar holdings could simply ship them to the United States and receive gold bars in return. This guarantee underpinned everything. It made the dollar the unchallenged king of currencies and turned America into the world's central banker, a role that brought both immense privilege and, as it would turn out, an impossible burden. But there was a problem lurking at the heart of this system, a mathematical time bomb that a Belgian economist named Robert Triffin identified as early as 1960. Triffin saw what others missed. The world economy was growing rapidly, and with that growth came an ever-increasing demand for dollars to facilitate international trade. Companies needed dollars to buy oil, to purchase machinery, to settle accounts across borders. Governments needed dollars to hold as reserves, to back their own currencies, to feel secure. But here was the dilemma. The only way for the United States to supply these dollars to the world was to run balance of payments deficits, sending more dollars out than came back in. Yet the more dollars America pumped into the global system, the more the ratio of dollars to gold reserves deteriorated. By the late 1950s, there were already more dollars circulating outside the United States than there was gold in Fort Knox to back them up. Triffin predicted the inevitable conclusion. If the United States stopped running deficits and stopped supplying dollars, the world economy would seize up from lack of liquidity, potentially triggering a global depression. But if America continued printing and distributing dollars, confidence in the gold backing would eventually collapse, and foreign governments would rush to exchange their paper for metal before the window slammed shut. For most of the 1960s, American policymakers tried to manage this contradiction through a series of increasingly desperate measures. They created the London Gold Pool, where central banks from 7 countries agreed to intervene in gold markets to maintain the official price. They restricted American investment abroad, trying to stem the outflow of dollars. They pressured Germany and Japan to hold more dollars and convert less gold. They negotiated and pleaded and occasionally threatened. But these were band-aids on a structural fracture, temporary fixes to a permanent problem. And then 2 massive new pressures emerged that would transform the manageable crisis into an existential threat to the entire system. The first was President Lyndon Johnson's ambitious vision for America. His Great Society programs that aimed to eliminate poverty and racial injustice through a sweeping expansion of federal power. Medicare and Medicaid to provide health care for the elderly and poor. Federal funding for education from preschool through university. Urban development programs to rebuild decaying cities. Legal services for those who couldn't afford lawyers. Job training programs. Nutrition programs. Environmental protection initiatives. The scope was breathtaking, The cost was enormous, and Johnson was determined to make it happen. He genuinely believed that America, the richest nation in human history, could afford to be generous to its own citizens. He was right about America's wealth. What he underestimated was the incompatibility between domestic spending ambitions and maintaining a currency pegged to gold at a fixed rate. The second pressure point was Vietnam. What began as a limited military advisory mission in the late 1950s escalated through the 1960s into a full-scale war that would eventually deploy over 500,000 American troops to Southeast Asia. The financial cost was staggering. Hundreds of billions of dollars in modern terms flowed out to support operations halfway around the world. Aircraft carriers, bombers, helicopters, artillery, ammunition, fuel, food, and all the countless supplies needed to sustain a modern military force in continuous combat. And unlike World War II, which America financed partly through war bonds and higher taxes, Johnson was deeply reluctant to ask for tax increases to pay for Vietnam. He feared, correctly, that the moment he asked Congress for a war tax, opposition to both the war and his domestic programs would crystallize and doom both initiatives. So Johnson pursued what he famously called the guns and butter strategy. Fight a major war abroad while building a great society at home, and finance both through deficit spending rather than taxation. In his 1966 State of the Union address, Johnson declared that America would not choose between military strength and social progress, that the nation was wealthy enough to afford both. In the short term, he was right. The economy boomed. Unemployment fell to historic lows, corporate profits soared. But inflation started creeping upward. In 1965, consumer prices rose at just over 1% annually. By 1966, it had jumped to 2.4%. Then 3.6% in 1967, 4.6% in 1968, 5.8% in 1969. Each year the number climbed, and with it, foreign governments grew increasingly nervous about holding an asset that was losing purchasing power month by month. The French were the first to call America's bluff. In February 1965, President Charles de Gaulle announced that France would begin converting its dollar reserves into gold at the official exchange rate. His finance minister publicly criticized what he called America's exorbitant privilege, the ability to print paper that other countries had to accept as payment because those same countries needed dollars to conduct international trade. It was, the French argued, a system that allowed America to export its inflation, to live beyond its means indefinitely, while other nations bore the cost. And they were right. Under Bretton Woods, if France or Germany ran persistent trade deficits, they would lose gold reserves and eventually be forced to devalue their currencies or implement painful austerity measures. But when America ran deficits, it simply printed more dollars, and the world had little choice but to accept them. Other countries watched France's gold conversions carefully. If one major nation was losing confidence, maybe they should hedge their bets too. By the mid-1960s, the trickle of gold leaving American vaults had become a steady stream. Germany converted some dollars. Switzerland converted. Even traditional American allies began quietly diversifying their reserves. The London Gold Pool, that cooperative effort to maintain the official gold price, collapsed in 1968 under the weight of speculative attacks. American gold reserves that had peaked at over 20,000 metric tons in the 1950s fell below 11,000 tons by 1971. At the rate things were going, Fort Knox would be empty within a few years. By the time Richard Nixon entered the White House in January 1969, he inherited an economic situation that was rapidly becoming untenable. Inflation was accelerating. The trade balance had shifted to deficit for the first time in decades. Foreign governments held dollars that far exceeded American gold reserves. And the Vietnam War showed no signs of ending soon, meaning the fiscal pressures would continue indefinitely. Nixon's economic advisors understood the mathematics. Something had to give. Either dramatically raise interest rates to defend the dollar, which would trigger a recession and doom Nixon's re-election chances, or devalue the dollar relative to gold, which would be politically humiliating and might not even work if foreign central banks kept demanding conversions, or abandon the gold standard altogether and let the dollar float, which would shock the global system but might give America the monetary flexibility it desperately needed. Through 1970 and into 1971, the crisis intensified. In May 1971, Germany stopped defending the fixed exchange rate for the mark and let it float upward against the dollar, a clear signal that major economies were losing faith in the Bretton Woods system. Speculation against the dollar reached fever pitch. Private traders, sensing that the official gold price was unsustainable, bought gold anywhere they could find it, driving prices on private markets well above the official $35 per ounce. American exports became increasingly uncompetitive because the overvalued dollar made U.S. goods expensive abroad. Manufacturing workers lost jobs. The political pressure on Nixon mounted from all sides. Labor unions demanded action to protect American industry. Business leaders wanted monetary stability. Financial markets wobbled. The president's approval ratings sagged. Then came the trigger event that forced Nixon's hand. In early August 1971, Britain, America's closest ally and the co-architect of the Bretton Woods system, requested that $3 billion worth of its dollar reserves be converted to gold. This wasn't France being difficult or Switzerland hedging. This was Britain, the steadfast partner, the nation that had fought beside America in 2 world wars, essentially declaring that it no longer trusted the United States to honor its commitments. If Britain was bailing, the game was over. Within days, other countries would surely follow, and the United States would face the humiliation of being unable to meet its gold obligations, effectively defaulting on the promise that underpinned the entire monetary system. Nixon called an emergency meeting at Camp David for the weekend of August 13th to 15th. The attendees read like a who's who of American economic power. Treasury Secretary John Connally, a tough-talking Texas politician who had no patience for international niceties. Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns, the distinguished economist who understood the system's intricacies. Paul Volcker, the tall, cigar-smoking undersecretary for monetary affairs, who would later become one of the most influential Fed chairmen in history. George Shultz, director of the Office of Management and Budget and future Secretary of State, and various other advisors, speechwriters, and economic specialists. For 3 days, they debated options in the rustic presidential retreat, isolated from press and public, making decisions that would reshape capitalism itself. The dynamic between the key players was crucial. Connally was hawkish, nationalist, and unconcerned with international consequences. He saw the gold standard as a constraint on American sovereignty and believed the United States should prioritize its own economic interests over maintaining a system that other countries were exploiting. Burns was more cautious, worried about inflation and the loss of monetary discipline that might follow abandoning gold. Volcker understood both perspectives, but recognized the mathematical reality. They simply didn't have enough gold to meet potential conversion demands, and pretending otherwise would only make the eventual crisis worse. The question wasn't whether to close the gold window, but how to present the decision to minimize panic and maximize America's bargaining position in whatever negotiations would follow. By Sunday evening, August 15th, they had their plan. Nixon would announce a comprehensive new economic policy combining the gold window closure with other dramatic measures. A 90-day freeze on wages and prices to combat inflation. A 10% surcharge on imports to pressure other countries into revaluing their currencies upward. Tax cuts to stimulate the economy. The package was designed to look decisive and comprehensive rather than desperate. Nixon would frame it not as retreat but as bold action to protect American workers and families from international speculators and unfair competition. The messaging was carefully crafted to transform a crisis into a moment of presidential leadership. That evening, Nixon preempted regular television programming to address the nation. Speaking in his characteristic earnest tone, he explained that international currency speculators were attacking the dollar and that decisive action was necessary to protect American jobs and purchasing power. He announced the temporary suspension of dollar convertibility into gold, emphasizing the word temporary, though there's evidence that many in his administration knew it would be permanent. He announced the import surcharge and wage price controls. He presented the package as patriotic defense of the American economy against foreign manipulation. The speech was politically masterful. Rather than admitting that America couldn't maintain its gold commitments, Nixon reframed the narrative as America choosing to stop letting other countries take advantage of its generosity. The immediate reaction was euphoric. The stock market soared the next day, posting its largest single-day gain on record at that point. Newspaper editorials largely praised Nixon's boldness. The public, already frustrated by inflation and economic uncertainty, supported measures that promised stability even if they didn't fully understand the implications. Internationally, the reaction was more mixed. Some countries were shocked by the unilateral action. Others had seen it coming and were prepared to adapt. But the fundamental question remained unanswered. If currencies were no longer pegged to gold through the dollar, what would they be pegged to? How would exchange rates be determined? What would happen to the international monetary order that had governed trade and finance for a quarter century? For several months, negotiators worked to salvage some version of fixed exchange rates. In December 1971, the group of 10 industrialized democracies met at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington and hammered out what became known as the Smithsonian Agreement. The dollar would be devalued to $38 per ounce of gold, and other currencies would be revalued upward. Exchange rates would remain fixed, but with slightly wider bands of fluctuation. Nixon hailed it as the most significant monetary agreement in world history. He was wrong. The Smithsonian Agreement lasted barely a year before market pressures overwhelmed it. In February 1973, the dollar was devalued again to $42.22 per ounce, and this time countries gave up trying to maintain fixed rates altogether. By March 1973, the major currencies were floating freely against each other, their values determined by market forces rather than government agreements. The Bretton Woods era had ended, and the modern fiat currency age had begun. The decade that followed was economically turbulent in ways that seemed to validate the warnings of gold standard advocates. Inflation accelerated through the 1970s, reaching double digits by decade's end. The dollar lost a third of its value against other major currencies. The 1973 OPEC oil embargo sent energy prices skyrocketing, contributing to a phenomenon economists called stagflation, the combination of stagnant growth and high inflation that conventional economic theory said was impossible. Interest rates climbed to unprecedented levels. Unemployment rose. Real wages stagnated. The term misery index was invented to capture the cumulative pain of high inflation and high unemployment. Americans who had enjoyed rising prosperity through the 1950s and 60s watched their standard of living erode year by year through the 1970s. It took Paul Volcker's appointment as Federal Reserve Chairman in 1979 and his radical tightening of monetary policy to finally break the inflation spiral. Volcker raised interest rates to nearly 20%, the highest in American history, deliberately triggering a severe recession to wring inflation out of the system. It worked, but at enormous cost. Unemployment hit double digits. Businesses failed by the thousands. Farmers lost their land. The early 1980s were economically brutal, but by mid-decade, inflation had been tamed and a new era of growth began. The fiat currency system survived its trial by fire. Looking back from our current vantage point, more than 50 years after Nixon's announcement, we can see more clearly what happened and why. The gold standard didn't fail because of a single policy mistake or because one president made a bad decision. It failed because the post-war international order had fundamentally changed in ways that made gold backing unsustainable. The global economy had grown too large, too complex, too interconnected to be constrained by the available supply of a single metal. The demand for international liquidity, for a medium of exchange to facilitate world trade, far exceeded what could be provided while maintaining meaningful gold convertibility. The Triffin Dilemma, predicted a decade before the crisis actually hit, had identified an inherent mathematical contradiction. America couldn't simultaneously serve as the world's reserve currency provider, maintain fixed gold convertibility, pursue domestic full employment policies, and allow free movement of capital. Something had to break, and what broke was gold. The Vietnam War and Great Society programs accelerated the crisis, certainly. Had America maintained fiscal discipline through the 1960s, the gold window might have stayed open a few more years. But ultimately, the contradiction was structural rather than contingent. Even with perfect fiscal policy, the growing global economy would have eventually demanded more dollars than could be backed by gold reserves at the fixed price. The only alternative would have been to dramatically raise the official gold price, perhaps to $100 or $200 per ounce, but that would have been seen as a humiliating devaluation and might not have restored confidence anyway. What we live with today is the direct descendant of the system born in that crisis. All major currencies are now pure fiat money, backed by nothing except the full faith and credit of the issuing governments and the collective trust that these pieces of paper or digital entries in bank computers will be accepted as payment tomorrow. The value of currencies relative to each other fluctuates constantly, determined by the complex interplay of interest rates, trade balances, capital flows, economic growth rates, and market psychology. Central banks have unprecedented power to expand or contract money supplies, to set interest rates, to inject liquidity into financial systems during crises. The Federal Reserve can, quite literally, create trillions of dollars with keystrokes on a computer, something that would have been impossible under gold backing. This flexibility proved crucial during the 2008 financial crisis and the 2020 COVID pandemic, when central banks pumped enormous amounts of money into the economy to prevent total collapse. Under a gold standard, such intervention would have been impossible, and the economic damage might have been far worse. But this flexibility also enables governments to finance deficits through money creation to effectively tax people through inflation rather than explicit taxation, to engage in what critics call monetary manipulation and supporters call counter-cyclical policy. The debate over whether abandoning gold was beneficial continues among economists, with no clear consensus. What's undeniable is that the decision Nixon made that August weekend transformed the fundamental nature of money itself. For thousands of years, from ancient civilizations through the modern era, money had been tied to commodities, usually precious metals. The idea that money should have intrinsic value, that paper currency was just a convenient claim check for real wealth stored in vaults, was deeply embedded in human psychology and economic thought. The shift to pure fiat currency, where money has value simply because governments declare it to have value and people accept that declaration, represented a radical break with history. We're still living with the consequences of that break, still debating whether it was necessary or beneficial, still dealing with the inflation and monetary instability that critics attribute to the lack of gold discipline. The dollar has remained the world's reserve currency, despite no longer being backed by gold, a testament to America's economic size, military power, legal system, and the depth and liquidity of its financial markets. But that status is no longer automatic or guaranteed. Other countries accumulate dollars not because they can exchange them for gold, but because they believe in the stability of American institutions and the usefulness of dollars for international transactions. Trust has replaced metal as the foundation of the monetary system, and trust is more fragile, more subject to political decisions and economic management. The 1970s showed what happens when that trust wavers, and the specter of that turbulent decade continues to haunt policymakers today. In the end, the real reason we left the gold standard was simpler and more complex than most narratives suggest. It wasn't just Nixon's decision or the Vietnam War or Great Society spending, though these accelerated the timeline. It was the collision between the immutable mathematics of a finite commodity and the expansionary dynamics of a growing global economy. It was the impossible burden placed on America by its role as reserve currency issuer in a system where providing liquidity required running deficits that undermined confidence in the backing. It was the realization, finally forced by Britain's conversion request, that the emperor had no clothes, that American gold reserves couldn't possibly meet potential claims, and that continuing to pretend otherwise would only make the eventual reckoning more catastrophic. Nixon didn't choose to end the gold standard so much as recognize that it had already ended in all but name, and that acknowledging reality was less damaging than maintaining a fiction that everyone knew was unsustainable. The gold window closed because it had to close, because keeping it open was no longer mathematically possible, and because the alternative was watching America's gold reserves drain to zero while the dollar collapsed in a disorderly panic. What happened on August 15, 1971, was the moment when financial reality caught up with international agreements, when the contradictions inherent in Bretton Woods finally overwhelmed the system's ability to adapt, and when America made the choice to preserve its monetary sovereignty at the cost of abandoning the gold anchor that had provided discipline and credibility for generations. We're still living in the world that decision created, and we're still discovering what it means to have a global monetary system built entirely on trust and convention rather than metal stored in vaults.